Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Our guest today is Jean Lee. Jean is director of the Wilson Center's Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy. Jean's also a former bureau chief in Pyongyang for Associated Press. Jean, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hi.
I think every time we plan to speak to you, we write down the sort of working title, North Korea Update, because it's an ongoing story that needs to be updated. And so where do we stand in the aftermath of Kim Yong-chol's visit to the U.S.?
Well, we have a target date. They are saying there will be a second summit in the end of February. We don't know the location. We've certainly heard rumors that it may be in Vietnam, which makes sense. But what we don't have is a roadmap, and that is certainly a concern among many of us who watch this. And that's what we'll see in the weeks ahead is the working level officials trying to nail down what is going to happen at that summit and what these two leaders are going to agree on.
When you say Vietnam makes sense, is that because it's on the very short list of countries that have good relations with both countries?
A number of reasons. When I look at potential locations, you have to look, of course, we're thinking about what it is President Trump wants out of this, but I also look at what North Korea needs. For example, like Singapore, Kim Jong-Un wants to use that as a moment for propaganda. And so he would want to go to a place that can serve as an example to his people for what that path might be. And Vietnam is intriguing. Of course, a longtime foe. The United States fought a very bitter war with Vietnam, but is now on friendly terms. There's been a lot of commercial investment by U.S. companies in Vietnam, so that's an interesting example as well. But also, very importantly, it is a country that has hosted major international events. So the other thing I look at is this a country that can assure the North Koreans that they have the security to provide? And for example, Vietnam has been a host to, say, ASEAN regional forum gatherings in the past. And so they have very recently shown the North Koreans and hosted the North Koreans and shown both the Americans and the North Koreans that they can host this type of event.
Having experience matters in these affairs. So, you've been on this treadmill for several years now as this story has become one of the stories globally. And we've gone from crisis on the Korean Peninsula to a sense of optimism. And there's a hurry up and wait period we seem to be in right now. Where what has substantively changed since the last summit?
That's a very good point. It's been 7 months now since Singapore, the first summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-Un. And to be honest, we've seen very little in terms of concrete denuclearization on North Korea's part since then. And so there certainly is the sense that we have to make some movement here. We have to move ahead or find some way to nail them down. But we don't want to go too quickly because we want to make sure we map out exactly what it is we get the North Koreans to agree to in exchange for concessions on the U.S. side. So it's an interesting push and pull. Certainly we want to make sure that we're moving toward disabling that threat, but we don't want the president to agree to anything too quickly. We want to make sure that we have some guarantees from the North Koreans in return for whatever concessions the president may offer.
Well, what about movement between the two Koreas during that period?
And that's been the interesting trend throughout 2008. The inter-Korean relationship has improved dramatically. And this is interesting too because I do think the North Koreans want to get the South Koreans and the South Korean president on their side and use South Korea as a way to pressure the United States to move more quickly in offering up concessions. So it is something that has tested the U.S.-South Korean alliance. I do think that alliance is very strong, has a long history, and there are many historical, financial, social reasons why the United States and South Korea have such a strong relationship that will not be unbroken. That can't be broken very easily, but it has tested it. And so I do think you have the South Korean president also putting pressure on the United States, saying, listen, we need to move on this, otherwise it's going to harm our relationship.
A step along the way, perhaps, to denuclearization is the formal end of the Korean War. How important is that to all the sides involved?
This has been certainly a topic of discussion, and the Korean War remains in a ceasefire that was signed in 1953. And it has been central to North Korea's ideology, this idea that they are still locked in an active war. I do think Kim Jong-un wants to move past this and start focusing on the economy. What he wants is some sort of statement to tell his people that he's won the war, or he wants to declare victory in some way. And certainly having some sort of end or declaration of an end would be something he can take back to his people. Mm-hmm. Now, to sign a peace treaty is a long and complicated process, and so what we're not going to get is a formal peace treaty, but we may see some sort of political declaration, which is something both the South Koreans and the North Korean leaders have been pushing. And so I do suspect that that has been part of the discussions. That will be a concession on the part of the United States to agree to that kind of a declaration. And so it's something that has to be leveraged very, very carefully on the part of the United States in these discussions regarding denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. So you saw this new report from CSIS about undeclared missile bases. I wonder, do you think it changes the equation as far as the trust level if there are these so-called undeclared bases? I think the number was 20. And so there has been no move to shut those down.
I think this type of reporting is very valuable because we have not had any kind of candid reporting of these types of sites from North Korea. And that's one of the issues, is that the United States has demanded and asked for a list of these sites. North Korea is not agreeing to that. They see it as a violation of their independence. Certainly that's not something they will give up very easily. So it is interesting and important that we use satellite imagery to try to get a sense for where these bases are.
How reliable is this reporting?
I think that these experts have been looking at these issues for quite some time, and they use satellite imagery. Satellite imagery has gotten very, very good.
They have hard evidence. They have pictures.
They have pictures. They can see this from above. We can't get on the ground, so we have to use satellite imagery to try to guesstimate what's happening on the ground, and some of the movements can be tracked. Mm-hmm. I think it's very useful for us to have a sense for how large this program is. Now, the North Koreans and Kim Jong-un did promise to stop testing ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, and he has stuck to that promise. He never said he wouldn't stop developing them or maintaining them. And so in some sense, he hasn't violated any agreement with President Trump. However, I should note that any production or construction of ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons is a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions that prohibit North Korea from this type of activity. It's still a violation. We should keep that in mind.
One of the things the author of the report said, the North Koreans are not going to negotiate over things they don't disclose. So how important is it that they just completely come clean and make clear what is the totality of their capacity?
Full disclosure, a full list of their assets is certainly something that the United States needs to press for and has pressed for in the past. But it's a complicated negotiation, and if you're going to start asking or demanding things that won't even get the North Koreans to the table, then it's dead upon arrival. So what they're trying to do is find ways to get the North Koreans to the table and map out this, what we're calling this roadmap, mm-hmm. map out this step-by-step process, and certainly not only demanding a full list, but also being able to verify either the sites or the dismantling of certain sites will be part of that process.
About that roadmap, back to this notion that you started with a sprint around a crisis and now you're in a marathon over a long roadmap. Help us set our expectations for how this plays out and how long it will take.
Which part? The denuclearization,
yes,
or just assembling the roadmap, because both of them
let's maybe speak to both.
So with the roadmap, I mean, to be honest, what we have now, we're nearing the end of January. We have a potential proposed second summit coming up in the end of February. That's a month. That is not a whole lot of time for these working level officials to map out the step-by-step process of denuclearization. So that's a huge amount of homework that lies ahead. Part of the challenge is that the North Koreans have been very good about restricting access, so canceling meetings, preventing their working level officials from meeting the Americans who would be their counterparts. So a lot of it will be contingent on the United States' ability to nail those North Koreans down, to sit down with them and map this out. So the roadmap itself is crucial, but just drawing up that roadmap will be a huge challenge in the weeks ahead. Now, for the roadmap itself, it is very complicated. We're talking about two countries that have very different definitions of denuclearization. We're talking about North Korea, which is looking at the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So they're saying, we will give up our nuclear weapons when you give up yours. Now, the United States, on the other hand, is saying, no, we're talking about the denuclearization of North Korea. Those are two very different definitions and two very different objectives. Yep. And so I think that they're going to have to map out step by step how they're even going to get closer to a definition. It's clear that the North Koreans are going to expect concessions for each step that they take. And so the United States is going to have to be very smart about what they offer up, and to make sure that every time they offer a concession that they get something verifiable and concrete from the North Koreans in return. This process could take a very long time. I'm sorry to do this to you, guessing, but is there a best case, worst case scenario in terms of time? Are we talking 2 years versus 7 years? Is there any way to quantify this? I think it's very difficult.
Yeah, we could leave it at that. I don't want to force you to say something that's not realistic. But
well, what I was going to say is it's in the North Koreans' interest to drag this out as long as they can. Kim Jong-Un does not want to give up his weapons. The nuclear weapons are so highly valued, not only in terms of his legacy, but also he's been telling the people of North Korea that they remain protected because of these nuclear weapons. He's going to drag this process out as long as he
drop back into the pack. You're just another non-nuclear nation if you don't have that.
Exactly. And so I think that he is looking at finding a way to get involved in this negotiation, get some concessions in return, but hold on to his weapons as long as he can, if not forever. So it's very hard to put a number on how many years it would take. I guessed as much,
but I felt like I had to ask. Jean, thank you very much for helping us sort through the complexity of the issue.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us as well. And we hope you'll join us again for another edition of Wilson Center Now. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.